Suffrage Association worked to win suffrage for women by amending the state constitutions. And you see a picture there of Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who, as you may know, were important leaders in the suffrage movement. When Frances Willard became president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union in 1879, she made the organization an important supporter of the suffrage movement, believing that women voters would end the sale of liquor. The liquor industry, as you can imagine, was vehemently opposed to suffrage because they too thought women would vote to end liquor sales. Prohibition and suffrage became linked in many of the subsequent suffrage campaigns. In 1885, the Ohio Women's Suffrage Association was formed, and a few years later, Harriet Taylor Upton became its president. Upton was very important in the Ohio suffrage movement because she organized multiple suffrage events across the state. In 1890, those two national organizations that I just talked about merged into one powerful suffrage association, the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Quite a mouthful. In 1913, suffragist Alice Paul and others organized a massive suffrage parade in Washington, D.C., just the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. And this is the impressive program cover for that event. And I'm going to say a little bit more about this 1913 parade later. In 1915, another large suffrage parade that included more than 25,000 women occurred in New York City. By 1916, Alice Paul's National Women's Party, which was more radical than the other large national organization, staged demonstrations, marched in parades, and picketed the White House. Members of the National Women's Party were repeatedly arrested and jailed. As you can see here, she's being hauled off to jail. Some were force-fed when they went on hunger strikes while in jail. In 1919, this is what the United States looked like in terms of suffrage laws, a hodgepodge. So if you look over here, all these states that don't have any color granted women full suffrage. These states that are all in black, no suffrage, and the rest with some other combination of patterns had various ways of allowing women to vote. If we take a look at Ohio, here's Ohio, it allowed municipal suffrage in charter cities, which meant that women could vote in local elections in certain cities that had their own charters. So quite a hodgepodge nationally. Finally, in 1919, the U.S. House of Representatives approved the Susan B. Anthony Amendment exactly as it had been written in 1878 by the vote that you see there. And then the Senate also passed the bill. And Ohio actually ratified fairly quickly, was the sixth state to ratify. Just the next year, 1920, more than 8 million American women voted for the first time in the presidential election of 1920. And the League of Women Voters was formed that same year by former suffragists. So with that background, let's move on to Butler County. I'm going to just flip through a few quick slides just to give you a sense of what Butler County looked like at the time. As you may know, Hamilton was a big city for that time period. As a county seat and a manufacturing center, it was by far the largest city in the county. According to the 1919-1920 Hamilton City Directory, there were 7 moving picture theaters, 46 physicians, 22 restaurants, and 67 saloons. Middletown was second in size and is also a fairly substantial city. You can see the mixture here of cars and streetcar and horses still. This is Oxford during this period. Miami University was, of course, well established by this time. And as we will soon see, suffragists were active in Oxford. But most of Butler County was rural. Many roads were unpaved, and this is Ross in 1910, but that made moving around the county a bit difficult. So there were two time periods when the movement in Butler County was particularly important, and that was 1912 and 1914. And that was the case because there were attempts to amend the Ohio Constitution at both of those time periods. So we will start with 1912. During 1912, a statewide competition was held to create a suffrage poster for the state of Ohio. The competition was won by Cornelia Cassidy Davis, who taught art at the Western Female Seminary in Oxford from 1889 to 1891. And the Western Female Seminary, as you may know, was later known as Western College. I think this is just a striking poster. If you take a close look at this Ohio seal down here, this is the Ohio seal in 1910, and you can see that Cornelia Cassidy Davis took inspiration from the Ohio seal. So you can see the sheaves of wheat here, and the spears here, and the rising sun, the mountains in the background. So this poster actually has been used quite a bit in talks and programs about suffrage, just because it's such a gorgeous poster. Several large events took place across the county in 1912 during the first campaign for a state amendment. For example, Margaret Foley, a nationally known suffragist from Boston, spoke at the courthouse in Hamilton. The Hamilton Evening Journal, which, by the way, was the primary newspaper in the county at the time, congratulated the city for securing such an important speaker. Also in 1912, over 250 people met in Lindenwold, where they heard socialist Fred Hinkle encourage workers to vote for suffrage. Face-to-face events were also components of the 1912 campaign, and this is one of my favorite stories among all those we discovered. It's about Louise Hall of Cincinnati, and this is Louise Hall here on the right. When she was in Middletown trying to stimulate interest in suffrage, she had difficulty reaching factory workers during their lunch hours at different locations in the city because of those rural roads. So Mr. F.L. Valiant of the Miami Cycle and Manufacturing Company solved her problem. He offered his Flying Merkle motorcycle and sidecar. And Hall was whisked from one factory to another and was able to speak at 3 factories in 1 hour using the sidecar as a platform. I just think that's so cool. If you can imagine somebody at that time, a woman in a sidecar, speaking to the crowd. Of course, the local newspapers weighed in on the suffrage issue too. The Butler County Democrat suggested that women as a whole, quote, do not ask for the ballot, unquote. As evidence, the paper said that very few women voted in school board elections where they were allowed to vote. Their indefinite conclusion was that, quote, women's suffrage is a question that every man must settle for himself. The Hamilton Evening Journal, on the other hand, printed several pro-suffrage articles. In July of 1912, the journal published an article stating, quote, there is no reason why women should not have the ballot. They are capable, they are trustworthy, they do now and always have done their fair share of the world's work. The time has now come when men can no longer be justified in withholding from women the same rights he claims for himself, unquote. This sign at the Ohio Suffrage headquarters is addressed directly to male voters. You can see it at the top there, asking for a square deal. But despite the best efforts of women across the state, the 1912 amendment to the Ohio Constitution failed. Butler County male voters rejected the amendment with the vote you can see there, 41% and 41.7% in favor and 58.3% opposed. And the issue lost in Ohio by a similar percentage. But just the next year, the massive Washington, D.C. parade that I mentioned earlier was held. Recall that the parade was planned specifically to coincide with Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. A number of Butler County suffrage supporters attended that parade, Adina Myers, a Hamilton lawyer, served as the chair of the local committee and adopted the slogan, "On to Washington." The Ohio contingent traveled to Washington on a special train called the Ohio Woman and rented a house near Union Station where they could, quote, rest, refresh themselves, and provide themselves with suffrage supplies, buttons, and regalia. Adina Myers wrote in the Hamilton Evening Journal that, quote, the ceremonies attending the induction into the office of the president was second in interest and beauty to the pageantry of the woman's suffrage parade, unquote. Okay, so give me just a second here. I've got to, okay. So let's move on to the 1914 campaign to amend the Ohio Constitution. Harriet Taylor Upton, who, if you recall, was president of the Ohio Women's Suffrage Association, accompanied national leaders on a tour of Ohio in 1914, including a stop in Hamilton. Carrie Chapman Catt, who was president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, that's quite a mouthful, gave a talk in Hamilton in October 1914. I was quite surprised to learn that suffragists of the stature of Carrie Chapman Catt spoke in Butler County. It's very impressive. Local suffragists also continued to address large groups. At one event, Frances Richard, a Miami University professor, spoke at the YMCA building in Hamilton. The Hamilton Evening Journal described the event saying, quote, a bevy of charming high school girls with their badges of a Let Mother Vote added much charm to the meeting, unquote. A few local men, including Henry Haynes and Dr. Mark Millikan, also spoke in favor of suffrage in 1914. Numerous talks and meetings were held in smaller towns in Butler County too, including Somerville, 7 Mile, Monroe, Dartown, Riley, Bethany, and Westchester. By 1914, both Hamilton and Middletown had equal suffrage associations that met regularly, and a suffrage club was formed at Miami. So you can see the headline in this girls issue, note this girls issue. Here's suffrage club organized. The Miami Student was and is the student newspaper for the university. The paper reported that, quote, the aim of the organization still proves that the Miami woman is never radical. It is to study the question of suffrage for women. With such an aim, many girls are going into it who have not yet been convinced of the necessity of women demanding the ballot, end quote. The paper concluded its article with the editorial comment, quote, Miami should send out women who are capable of being leaders in the suffrage world, end quote. A large suffrage parade took place in Dayton in October 1914, just before the November election. 2,000 people, including 400 men, 3 bands, and 20 automobiles decorated in the colors of the suffrage movement took part. Women carried the banners of the various towns and counties represented, and you can see the banners here. We so hoped we would find a picture with a Butler County banner, but we did not. But we do know that quite a number of suffrage supporters marched behind the Butler County banner. The Hamilton Evening Journal reported that, quote, never in the history of Dayton, it is said, have so many people witnessed a parade, and never was a parade given a more courteous welcome by onlookers, end quote. So this is a sample ballot that was placed in the Hamilton Evening Journal by the Ohio Women's Suffrage Association the day before the 1914 amendment vote. So you see the X here to extend suffrage for women. But again, Butler County's male voters rejected the state amendment. This time was a worse vote, only 34.2% in favor, even greater than 1912, greater defeat. Statewide vote wasn't quite as bad, but the amendment was soundly rejected at state level too. So how disheartening that must have been to the women who had worked so hard. But just 5 years later, by 1919, the world had changed. World War I was the most important event on the minds of Butler County residents. Butler County women filled jobs previously held by men and contributed greatly to the war effort. Support for suffrage grew at the national level, and the 19th Amendment to the National Constitution was finally passed in June of 1919. So the strategy of a national amendment was the one that prevailed. So I find this map very interesting. So the green is where the votes were yes. This is U.S. House Representative votes. All the green are yes votes. Look at this wide swath of no votes in the South. Look at here, this tiny little piece of red. Our representative in Butler County, Warren Gard, voted no. So there were many local women active in the suffrage movement and a number of men, but during our initial research, we identified 4 women who were particularly prominent. And I'm going to tell you just a bit about each woman. So up here in the corner, unfortunately, we couldn't find a picture of Adina Myers, but she was the first woman to graduate from the University of Cincinnati Law School and the first female attorney in Hamilton. She was very active during the 1912 and 1914 campaigns and marched in both the DC parade and in the Dayton parade. She also represented suffrage groups at national meetings. Frances Gibson Richard, that I mentioned just a minute ago, was a member of the Miami University English faculty. She was a frequent speaker at local suffrage meetings and served as a delegate to the 1913 National Suffrage Convention. Richard Hall at Miami is named in her honor. Margaret Johnson Brandenburg, whom you see here, began her suffrage work with her parents in Kansas. After moving to Oxford, she also served as a delegate to the 1913 convention in DC. And she also spoke at numerous events in Ohio and was active in the League of Women Voters after its formation. And over here you see Rose Giddings Haynes. She was president of the Butler County Equal Suffrage Association from 1915 to 1920, which was a critical time. She was one of the first women to be elected to public office after suffrage and served on the Hamilton Board of Education. So remember Rose Giddings Haynes named here because I want to share an interesting twist to the story of Rose. After we had finished our exhibit, I went back to my long time task of going through old boxes of clothing at the Historical Society. And I actually have been working my way through these boxes for 8 years when I finally got to the last box and found the dress you see here. So you can imagine my surprise when I found a handwritten label attached to the dress that said Rose in Butler County. So after our exhibit was up and Mary and I gave this presentation for Miami's Learning and Retirement Program, we were contacted by 2 women whose ancestors had been active in the suffrage movement in Butler County. The suffragist on the left is Stella Lowenstein Silver, and she may look feminine and delicate, but her granddaughter, Betty Armstrong, refers to her as a maverick. Stella was the first female to get a driver's license in Butler County. She shared many stories with Betty about picketing with a group of women all wearing white dresses, crashing city and county meetings, and generally, quote, driving those men crazy. Stella had a tremendous influence on Betty, who of course went on to become a professional herself. Rose Cook Sherlock is pictured on the right, and I'm going to quote from the letter her granddaughter Pat Gantz sent. So, quote, it was a surprise to many when Rose became interested in the women's suffrage movement due to her quiet, gentle demeanor. But with the support and encouragement of her husband, she became active in the fight for women's right to vote around 1917. Her first child was born in 1918, and with the help of her husband and sisters, she was able to continue her contributions to the cause. Her husband would make himself available to watch the baby so Rose could attend the different functions within the movement. End quote. What an interesting story. I also find it interesting how both women were supported by husbands, and I'm sure there were many more women and their husbands who contributed to the suffrage movement whose stories were lost through the years. So before Mary talks about the anti-suffrage movement and about registration and voting in Butler County, I want to say just a word about the use of white during the suffrage movement. White clothing was adopted by suffragists for a number of reasons. First, it communicated femininity and purity, rejecting the stereotype of suffragists as masculine. Second, a sea of women in white at parades had a visual impact. I think you see that in this picture here. This is the New York parade, especially a bit against a backdrop of men in dark suits. Finally, white was a common color in the early 20th century. The new ready-made dresses were often white, and almost every woman had a white dress in her closet that could be used for a suffrage parade. So white has continued to be used as a symbol of solidarity with those who fought so relentlessly for the right to vote. In 2019, down here, a group of congressional women wore white to the State of the Union address to honor the suffragists who paved the way before them. And you may recall Hillary Clinton wore white off and on. Kamala Harris wore white. So it's still a color of to recognize the suffragists. So I am going to stop sharing here and hand it over to Mary for the next part.
Okay, I'm going to share. All right, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Good, perfect. Well, this is Mary Royer, and I'm here with part 2 of Butler County's Fight for Suffrage. And I'm going to start with a glimpse into the anti-woman suffrage movement. So it can give you some insight into where all that opposition to women's suffrage came from. And even though it can seem astonishing to some people today, and I've noticed that especially when I bring high school or middle school children through the exhibit, there was a strong anti-suffrage movement in the United States. The movement began in the 1870s in response to the growing woman suffrage movement. The first national headquarters of this anti-suffrage association, pictured here, was established in 1911 in New York City, although there had been plenty of mounting organized resistance to the suffrage movement from state-level groups, among them Ohio's Anti-Suffrage League, formed in 1902. Opposition came from many fronts, including other women. This October 1867 edition of Godey's Lady's Book, a very influential women's magazine of the time, was found recently in a Hamilton attic, with other magazines belonging to a Mrs. M. Hughes. She may have read the editorial written by Sara Josepha Hale, pictured here, in which Hale issued her opinion of women's suffrage. Her opinion was rooted in the widely held concept of separate spheres for women and men based on their innate characteristics, defined here in her words. For example, woman is the exemplar, man is the lawgiver. Her emphatic conclusion to the woman suffrage question, no, I reply unhesitatingly, no. Domestic life was for women, public life was for men. Women were to use their moral authority and influence to shape and sway male voters, and must avoid associating with partisan politics, as this float slogan suggests. We can serve home and country without the vote. Acceptable outlets outside the home for middle and upper class women were an unpaid charity work, fundraising, church work, and social betterment causes. A woman's destiny was the proper fulfillment of her womanly role, and any participation in political activity would, quote, deteriorate the feminine nature and fatally injure society, declared Sara Hale. This belief really formed the backbone of anti-suffrage thinking. Reporting in the local papers like the Journal News, the Daily Republican News, there was very little about anti-suffrage activities, except that I found this article that described strong anti-suffrage organizations in Cincinnati and Dayton. The Cincinnati Area Anti-Suffrage League was led by Florence Goff Schwartz, pictured here. And she was a formidable anti-suffrage leader. Under her guidance, the league in Cincinnati organized tours of county fairs and distributed thousands of pieces of literature to spread their anti-suffrage message, and with the goal to expand the anti-suffrage majority obtained from the 1912 vote in Ohio. And as Sara pointed out, the Butler County male electorate voted against women's suffrage again in 1914 and increased that nay vote compared to 1912, which was the expressed goal of the Cincinnati Anti-Suffrage League. Anti-suffrage support came from various fronts. Religious institutions believed woman was subordinate to man, and her duty was to home and family. Suffrage would disrupt fulfillment of those duties and cause moral decline. Women themselves feared the loss of their values, their influence, and womanly domain. Some women believed that women did not have the time, inclination, or ability to fully grasp politics. Male voters were concerned that their influence and voting power would be weakened by women's votes. As Sara mentioned, liquor interests also feared that women would vote for prohibition and damage the liquor industry. But interestingly, prohibition, the 18th Amendment, was ratified anyway in January 1919, 1.5 years prior to full women's suffrage. Industrialists also felt threatened by the voting potential of reform-minded women and feared that they would vote to regulate work hours, wages, and factory conditions, and even seek to abolish child labor. There were regional reasons as well, as you see on this slide. Southern women and allies openly strove to preserve white supremacy, as you see in the last reason here. They feared that enfranchised African Americans would believe themselves to be social equals too, thus undermining the Southern way of life. Some supported suffrage for white women through a state, not a federal amendment, so existing disenfranchisement measures could be maintained. They were afraid that the federal government would oversee elections if there was a federal amendment, as you see right here, because because the South had been notified that federal authorities will supervise elections. And they were afraid that the restrictive voting practices that already entrapped African American men would be terminated. The anti-suffrage movement used the medium of printed postcard sets with pointed visual messages as one way to circulate its position. And these cards from 1909 exaggerated the conditions men would face, warning them about turmoil in the home and other perils that would result from women winning suffrage. The diarists seemed to be the masculinization of women and the feminization of men, threatening those separate female-male spheres. And I think this postcard on top is a great kind of example of that exaggeration, with the text, "I want to vote, but my wife won't let me." And also the women, these caricatures poked fun of suffragists by depicting the women in these postcards as domineering, selfish, unfeminine, and coquettish. Okay, now we're picking up in Butler County following ratification. And even though the focus is on Butler County, I think many of these activities and events that are covered do offer insight into what unfolded in many communities across Ohio and the country at this time. The response to this announcement of Tennessee's ratification of the 19th Amendment on August 18, 1920, was a burst of activity across Butler County in preparation for the November presidential election that would include the new woman voter. Local newspapers reported on these activities, wrote editorials, sought opinions, and estimated voter numbers. There were many big, bold, front page headlines just like this one, announcing these activities in the following 2.5 months until voting day. A total of 18,000 women across Butler County would be eligible to vote, potentially doubling voter rolls, which immediately set in motion plans by the Board of Elections to redistrict the cities and county to accommodate this substantial increase. As seen over here in this little sub-headline, it says tally of 49 to 47, but foes win right to recall resolution. Tennessee anti-suffragists began efforts right away to maneuver a revote in an attempt to bring a reversal of that House's decision. They ultimately appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, where the challenges were finally dismissed in 1922. And I think these kind of efforts show that issues are not always as neatly concluded as they appear. This headline, subheadings, and quotes ranging from delight to disinterest reflect the reactions of some county women to this historical transformation. And here's Rose Haynes on top. I am so glad the fight is over and won. And on the bottom, Mrs. Joe Adelsberger says, I won't be voting. I don't believe in it. The Hamilton Daily News expressed skepticism in its editorial about the reality of women's suffrage, lamenting, quote, the present day effort to reform too many things, and cautioning that, quote, we will never reform nature, and nature has not given to women the same instinctive desire to take part in public affairs or political contest as is present in men. A real echo of Hale's editorial 53 years earlier. In February 1920, just 6 months before the 19th Amendment was ratified, and perhaps in anticipation of ratification, the National American Woman Suffrage Association formed the, quote, women voters group within the association. It consisted of voters' organizations in those states where women already had full suffrage, which Sara showed you on the suffrage victory map. After passage of the amendment, the newly named League of Women Voters assimilated members of former state and local suffrage organizations. Its immediate purpose was to teach women how to exercise their new political rights and responsibilities. While many suffrage organizations merged into the League of Women Voters, Hamilton suffragist Rose Haynes, who we've already met, told the Daily News that the local Butler County suffrage organization would be, quote, disbanded and not collaborate, unquote. Haynes, though, went on to form a woman's city club in Hamilton and served as president for 10 years, so she remained active in civic affairs in her own way. I'm going to go back to 1918 just briefly on this slide to give background for the next slide. During the Progressive and World War I eras, women had clearly demonstrated their ability to organize and advocate for social betterment and political causes. And of course, the best example is their long-lasting, persistent suffrage campaign. During the war, women voluntarily took on crucial new roles in the workforce, replacing men who joined the armed forces. They had proved their patriotism and citizenship to the nation. When President Wilson addressed the Senate in 1918, here's a report of that on the bottom, he finally argued in favor of women's suffrage, and he acknowledged that World War I could not have been fought without the contributions of women. And this is his quote on top, recognizing what women did. So, politicians had begun to realize the power of female participation and that women voters might bring election victories. Local political leaders quickly tapped this resource and announced meetings for women to form Republican or Democratic Party clubs, although Rose Haynes did not think women needed a separate women's Republican club. The Lincoln Harding Club here in the center was a separate club for African Americans, as they were not included in the Republican Party club. The Daily News said it was the first ever political party club formed in Hamilton by and for African Americans. During this period of forming clubs, a Daily News editorial commented on the Democrats' courage in facing the women now, after having tried, quote, with every resource in its control to deprive these women of the right to vote. The clubs educated women on current issues and party planks in preparation for voting. The new woman voter was considered a valuable asset in doing ward work, and both parties assigned women to each precinct to campaign and, quote, line up the presidential vote for the party. You know, these women were experienced organizers. So who better was there to appeal for the female vote than another newly enfranchised woman? September 30th, 1920 was the first day of registration in Butler County, and announcements in the paper advised readers to register if they planned to vote in November's election. Here are some interesting facts about Ohio law at the time. It required all voters, men and now women, living in towns of 11,800 or more residents to register for every presidential election, whether or not they had voted in the previous election. Men were reminded to register, and as you see on top, take the women of your household with you. The League of Women Voters organized schools of citizenship to instruct women in their civic duties and sponsored voter registration activities, such as picnics and educational events. The Hamilton Daily News inserted the gift of a map in the paper so Hamilton citizens could find their registration and voting place without difficulty because so many new precincts had been created. And the newspapers really were serving the public by smoothing the path to the ballot box. Another interesting quirk about Ohio law was that women soon learned that the Ohio Secretary of State was of the opinion that women would have to give their age, not simply over 21, when registering, something that naturally modest women were reluctant to do. So a planned test case was filed in Cincinnati by Mrs. Eva Klein against the Hamilton County Board of Elections. The Ohio Supreme Court quickly issued a ruling that women must give their exact age to avoid fraudulent registrations. The Hamilton Daily News justified the decision by citing how previous elections were, quote, disgraced by men, unquote, registering and voting multiple times. Now, in the article here, women are urged to give their ages and to preserve the purity of the ballot. Turnout on the first day of registration was viewed as heavy and a predictor of exceptionally large registration in the days ahead. A Hamilton Evening Journal editorial stated that women's registration was large all over the country, showing that, quote, women do care to vote and will vote. A prevailing view in the anti-suffrage movement, of course, that I've gone over already, was that voting and political activity would diminish a woman's primary roles as moral guardian and caretaker of the home. But the journal observed that although thousands of women registered and, quote, came in contact with the contaminating influence of the polls, the homes of these women are still intact, unquote. The window card over here on the left reflects an attitude shift that replaced anti-suffrage rhetoric. Now they're saying voting is a responsibility of citizenship. You owe it to your country. And this certainly must have had resonance for all the women who contributed to the war effort and sent husbands and sons to battlefronts, personal exercises of their duty as citizens. And here on the bottom, we have our enthused Louise Eigelsbacher of Hamilton. At age 95, she was the oldest newly registered voter in Butler County. I think an inspiration in 1920 and today. In Ohio, the right to vote activated another right, selection for jury service, although this was not automatic everywhere. States differed on whether women's suffrage triggered women's jury service, some interpreting the right to vote more narrowly. Some state courts continued to deny women the full right to sit on juries, and rounds of court cases continued through the years until 1975, when the United States Supreme Court found a constitutional protection in the Sixth Amendment for women's unobstructed right to serve on juries. Writing for the court, Justice Byron White stated that the jury could not fulfill its fundamental role as a safeguard, quote, against exercise of arbitrary power, unquote, if any identifiable group, such as women, could systematically be excluded from the jury pool. White further explained that women had entered the workplace and their exclusion from jury duty could no longer be justified by asserting they have duties in the home. Look how long that idea lasted, that domestic life is for women. It's kind of baked in, cemented. Opinions and concerns about women jurors, or jurettes as the paper called them, surfaced, and some echoed anti-suffrage messaging. Here's a little sampling. She could be exposed to rough, foul language during testimony, and descriptions of sex offenses could be uncomfortable and mortifying to a lady. Women were too emotional to engage in rational analysis of evidence. The Hamilton Evening Journal noted that the Butler County Courthouse had no conveniences arranged for women. The Hamilton Daily News wrote that court officials could be imagining a woman coming to jury duty with a market basket on her arm while the angry home awaits a bite to eat, again conjuring up the image of the injured family, the suffering family. And there were arguments in favor also, such as it was a right of full and equal citizenship. Women would bring their unique perspective and experience and provide a genuine jury of peers to bring to true justice. Women were more refined than men, morally superior, and would readily distinguish truth from falsehood. The journal reported that a question arose in Butler County as to whether women could be called to jury service before they voted. And that notion was dispelled quickly when two Butler County judges clarified that the Constitution granted it to anyone who qualified as an elector. And here's what they're saying: the Constitution meant it. And they're very clear about the intention of the Constitution. So the names of newly registered women were placed in the wheel, mixed up, and then randomly drawn by hand. Only 3 days after this headline naming the first two women picked as jurors, which was Mrs. Snively and Mrs. McCabe, the journal announced that they had been excused from jury duty. Snively had a trip arranged, and McCabe said, quote, she did not feel as though she wanted to serve all alone with the men, unquote. But perhaps this gave the courthouse more time to add those conveniences for women. Meetings were held all over Butler County to instruct women on how to mark the ballot correctly. And this meeting here announced was in Trenton. Men also attended these meetings, but women and men were instructed on how to mark the ballot correctly, so their votes would not be invalidated on an election day. And sample ballots like these shown here, just the tops of the ballots, were provided instructions given on how to vote a straight or split ticket correctly. There were 4 presidential candidates and numerous party offices on the ballot, so careful marking was necessary, especially if not voting a straight ticket. So over here on the Democratic side, here's, if you want to vote a straight ticket, you just put an X in this circle and you're done. But if you go down and want to change offices, you have to be very careful not to vote for the same one twice. This is one of my favorite posters. But here we have a whole group of people urging women to vote. First were newspaper editorials who urged women to vote as their civic duty and responsibility, even if they had been opposed to suffrage. The journal advised new women voters to vote early in the day and avoid the evening rush, when men would arrive at polling places after their factory shifts. Religious leaders, such as Archbishop Moeller of Cincinnati, who had opposed suffrage, pressed women to vote as, quote, a privilege and plain duty, adding that, quote, abstaining will have regrettable results, unquote, although he didn't specify what they would be. He was addressing rumors claiming that the Pope in Rome was forbidding Catholic women to vote. In this poster, Columbia, a female symbol of the United States and considered the goddess of liberty, is guiding the way to the ballot box and demonstrating the importance of voting to the next generation of female voters. The woman voter is depicted in modern clothing for the time and is casting a ballot. And it symbolizes a redefinition of womanliness for this new era. A woman who votes is modest, feminine, and a faithful caretaker of her family. In other words, it is okay to vote. On Election Day, 8 million United States women voted, many for the first time in their lives. Nationally, 1/3 of eligible women voted, and men outvoted women by 5-3. Barriers to voting still existed, particularly in the South, where 4 states, Arkansas, South Carolina, Mississippi, and Georgia, deliberately blocked all women voters because they closed registration of new voters 6 months prior to the election, probably anticipating ratification would be successful. They could have passed emergency legislation to reopen registration for women following ratification, but they chose not to. And we know that through the years, many other discriminatory practices blocked voting participation for members of various ethnic and racial groups, causing the fight for voting rights to continue for decades longer. The percentages have changed, though. And I thought I'd just put this in here because it's kind of interesting to see what happened historically. As you see in this headline, the percentages changed in 1952 when women voters outnumbered men for the first time in history. The very idea of women voting was controversial and contested for a long time, but today women make up the majority of the voters. In the 2016 presidential election, 64% of eligible women voted, and they outvoted men by 4 percentage points. And the same results for the 2020 election show that women again outvoted men. November 2nd, 1920, was an extraordinary day for the new women voter of Butler County. They cast their first ballots in a presidential election and contributed to a large turnout, resulting in the most ballots ever counted in a Hamilton City and Butler County election. Most women had voted by midday, and the Journal took credit for the woman turnout because it had urged women to vote early. Down here, an election official in Oxford reported that women there knew exactly how they wanted to vote. He had expected them to know little about voting and ask a lot of questions. He reported they, quote, spent less time in the booths than did some men who had been voting for 20 years, unquote. He did not see a single woman's vote invalidated because of an error marking her ballot. All those training sessions paid off. There was an interesting headline in the Cincinnati Post. They also expressed some amazement that few women were confused by the voting process. And the Cincinnati Post went on to acknowledge that, quote, contrary to fears formerly expressed by anxious politicians, women's suffrage did not ruin one home Tuesday or even spoil a meal, unquote. Warren G. Harding won the election in a landslide victory. Here we are, a landslide victory. As a politician who favored women's suffrage, the votes of millions of women were considered to have been an important factor in his victory. Butler County, though, favored James M. Cox by 4 percentage points over Harding. But Harding swept Ohio by almost 20% over Cox. Well, we appreciate you attending our presentation, which was a project of the Butler County Suffrage Committee, and here are the names of the people who participated. And this was one of the scenes in the Benninghofen house where Sara had costumed several mannequins in period correct costumes. And now I will stop sharing so we can move to questions, comments, and the chat.
Well, it doesn't look like we have anything in the chat. Let me take a quick look. No. Does anybody have any questions or thoughts or comments?
I'm just going to say something about what we were talking about earlier this afternoon, Sara.
Okay.
We were talking about when we gave this presentation to another group, someone was interested in more vignettes of people from the time. And we were talking this afternoon about how all our information was just gleaned from newspaper articles. We often wished we knew how the 4 suffragists in Butler County interacted, the 4 important women, but there were no diaries. There were no lengthy interviews by newspaper people. There were nothing brought these women together in any way, in any kind of documented form. It was just, little quotes here and there in the paper, just reports of where they spoke. And, it's kind of interesting. Everything we learned was just newspaper reporting and, things from voting statistics.
Yeah.
I wondered if you could put this in context. I really enjoyed this. What do you think, are we in a position now where the equal rights amendment?
We're not hearing you, Dave.
Ah.
That's better.
Yeah, that was better for a second.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I wondered if you could put it in context to today and the question of the Equal Rights Amendment and the ability of women to have full and equal rights in 2020.
That's a tough question. This is my personal opinion, but I think some of those thoughts from the 19th century about separate spheres in some ways still linger on today. I mean, they certainly did when I was growing up in the 50s. I think a lot changed in the late 60s and 70s and continue to change because we know the next generation of women has a different environment than many of us had growing up. But yeah, I still think there's a little bit of that hanging around even now. And you know, when I saw the Speaker of the House and the Vice President last night being recognized for being the first time that women were sitting in those two chairs, I thought, wow, 100 years. It took 100 years for those two positions to be filled by women.
I also think that, if I can interject here, I think that that map you showed where the whole South was basically red and contrary to the popular, well, I don't know if it's contrary or not, opposed to suffrage. I don't think that's changed in terms of minorities today. If you look at what's going on with the Georgia anti-legislation, so on and so forth, anti-voting rather, I think that whole Southern bloc is still, now it's about minority blacks for the most part, but also I think that translates into women too today. The Equal Rights Amendment has not passed, right?
No, it never did.
Yeah.
No. And the other thing we learned, and now I'm not going to be sure of the date, but one of the Southern states just ratified the amendment, the 19th Amendment in the 1980s.
Yeah.
Mississippi.
You know that, Rich, was it 84 or something?
Yeah, it's 84, I think, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and if you remember the Equal Rights Amendment, Phyllis Schlafly was one of the most ardent people against it, and a fellow woman. You know, we think that all women would be on board in the same way, but it isn't a monolithic group. Women probably are just as opposed to half the stuff that's being presented as they were back then.
Yeah. Anything else? Well, thank you all so much
Well,
for coming.
there's a couple chats.
Oh,
One is saying, I find it interesting that states in the South are still trying to stop people voting.
Yeah.
I listened to that and I think, well, what I got out of just doing some of the research was even with things like jury duty, it wasn't just voting.
Mhm.
It was jury duty. There are all kinds of things put in place to keep women from being automatically registered to serve on a jury. It was just almost, like I say, baked in, this idea that women were somehow in the background and had to fight every step of the way to go. So I'm not sure the South is the only place trying to stop people from voting. There may be other nuggets of places in the states where that's happening too.
I think the industrials that you mentioned earlier as being opposed to it still are, for like the pay scales now.
Mm-hmm.
They're opposed to that $15 minimum wage and so on and so forth. So
Mm-hmm.
that's going to be really rampant again in the future, I think.
Yeah. Sarah, here's a question. Did Elizabeth Cady Stanton speak in other places in Butler County when she came to speak in Oxford? Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, just a little bit. And actually, Rich might know something about this too. I did not talk about Elizabeth Cady Stanton because I think she spoke early, maybe earlier in the 19th century. And we kind of focused on the first 20 years of the 20th century. I don't believe she spoke anywhere else. Do you know, Rich?
Well, I couldn't find anything
No.
more recent than 1890s for her.
Okay.
She dies like in 1904, I think, or something early on like that. And when there was a big a changeover in the leadership of the movement.
Okay.
Here's another one, Sarah. Is there any thought that so many men were off to war from 17 to 19 time period gave an edge to ratification, given the prior attempts? Did the men being away give an edge to ratification? I think that's what Jim is saying.
Yeah.
Because they were off to war, yeah. They certainly had an impact in England.
Yeah.
In what kind of a way?
Well, because the men were all fighting off World War I, and
there weren't any to vote.
Women were doing everything.
Yeah.
So that led to a lot of support for the women's efforts to get to vote.
Yeah, and if the question is that men were absent and couldn't vote, that wasn't the case here because by 1919,
They were all
men
home.
were back here. They were coming back in great numbers. We have to remember the pandemic is in the middle of this too, 1918.
And also in England, they had a two-tier situation where women up to a certain age could vote, but not beyond that, or vice versa, or whatever.
Yeah, and I think it had something to do with owning property too.
Yeah, I don't remember that part, but it might be. Yeah.
Here's from Shirley. I find it interesting that in Australia, voting is compulsory. You are punished if you don't vote in Australia. And that reminds me, I heard prior to the election last year, I was listening to NPR, an Australian man was talking about his disbelief. Here we are, we're free to vote and it's compulsory there. And only 64% of women, eligible women, vote in our country, fewer men. It is interesting.
Yeah, very.